Hello and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's UCAN session for the portion of Environment and Ecology, where we cover the important areas which have remained in news for the past couple of weeks associated with the Environment Ecology portion relevant for the prelims as well as relevant for the mains examination. As is the trend for these UCAN sessions, we shall be discussing certain important topics in news, certain protected areas which have remained in news, as well as the species which have managed to remain in news overall. But before we take a look into the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for today, an announcement for all of you. That is, tomorrow we are going to have a celebration that is Unacademy Pratishtha, which is going to be an event where you get a chance to have an interaction with the educators and where there are many surprises in store for you at 7 p.m. So do catch us live at UPSC Unstoppables channel at 7 p.m. Now, thereby, you can go to the channel, click on the notify me button, and then you can attend the session live. You will get many different events and many different surprises along the way. Now, do join us tomorrow. Now, having said that, let's take a look at the topics that we are going to discuss today. So today in total, we are going to have a discussion for 9 different areas and 9 different topics. Out of them, first of all, a summarization of what happened in the Conference of Parties 29 that was held in Baku, presided by Azerbaijan. Now, as we had discussed in the previous session as well, that on 25th of November, when we had the UCAN session, at that point of time, not many details had emerged out of the COP29. So today we are going to discuss about the various different issues which have cropped up and why the Conference of Parties meeting for United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is becoming a dicey issue. Then, the failure to arrive at a consensus for the Global Plastics Treaty. Why is it that the countries are unable to reach a consensus? And what is the Plastics Treaty? What is the importance of that? The High Seas Treaty, that has been in news as India has signed the High Seas Treaty. But there are certain systemic challenges within the treaty, which sometimes gives a greater amount of doubt whether even the implementation and ratification of treaty, whether it will solve any problem or will it simply push the problem for the future. World Drought Atlas has been released by United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD. So what is that World Drought Atlas and what does it tell us about India? With the help of this, we shall also be taking a look at the different types of drought that we experience and that is observed across the world. Then Atmanirbhar Clean Plant Program, what that is. Now, this was a kind of a program which was announced in last year's budget itself, but it has been in news because of the funding push and the loan given by ADB. Ratapani Tiger Reserve and Raimona National Park are the protected areas which have been in news. We will take a look at the region where they are. Ratapani Tiger Reserve becomes the newest addition to the Tiger Reserve, marking it and making it the 57th Tiger Reserve of the country and 8th Tiger Reserve of Madhya Pradesh. Raimona National Park has also been in news. So here, locational aspect of it will be relevant for your prelims purpose. Then 2 of the species have been in news. Red-breasted flycatcher has been sighted in the region of Hyderabad. It is a migratory species. And Indian star tortoise, that has also been in news. So overall, all these topics that you see, that brings about a mixture of various sources from Down to Earth, Indian Express, The Hindu, and so on. So that is where a comprehensive analysis and revision of these topics will prepare you in a very good manner for the prelims examination. I would suggest to you that do maintain a separate catalog along with the geography and the geography through maps that we are doing. Do maintain a separate catalog for the places in news and the species in news so that at the time of prelims, your job is quite simplified. Now, let us take a look at the first topic, and that is the Conference of Parties number 29, which was held in Baku. Now, this Conference of Parties number 29 is the Conference of Party for United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Right? Framework Convention on Climate Change. This convention is about lowering the amount of emission of greenhouse gases across the planet so as to reduce and limit the level of warming in the planet by around 2 degrees Celsius as compared to the pre-industrial level by the year 2100. This framework convention on climate change was arrived when? It was arrived at in 1992 as a result of the Rio Summit. So here, this is the 29th Conference of Parties which was held. Now, in this Conference of Parties, there was a significant amount of hope, large amount of hope which was associated with that regarding the aspect that this particular conference will yield certain results in terms of the funding mechanism. But that did not happen. In fact, the developed countries, it was found out that they were carrying out the negotiation for the funding, and the amount of money that they were to provide, that amount of money was simply inadequate for the demands of the developing countries. Now, the entire Framework Convention on Climate Change works on the basic principle of common but differentiated responsibility, CBDR. Common but differentiated responsibility. So this common but differentiated responsibility means what? That the developed countries of the world have a greater responsibility associated with climate change because it is their development which has led to the emission of gases, greenhouse gases, so to say. And those emission of greenhouse gases has led to the warming of the planet. And the impact of that climate change is now being experienced and witnessed by all the other countries across the world. So developed countries are more responsible and more accountable. That means they are required to cough up greater amount of money for mitigation and adaptation mechanisms of the developing nations in order to combat climate change, right? So here, let's take a look at the outcomes associated. India was significantly disappointed in this particular meeting of Conference of Parties, and what was India's stance and what was India's disappointment, right? Bengal cyclone, now that is not very relevant for the examination. In UPSC examination, particularly if you consider either the prelims or the mains, they will not ask you individual cyclones. If you want to, however, want to understand how the cyclonic event have taken place, I would suggest to you that in the same YouTube channel, do search about Cyclone Dana, which did impact the eastern coastline last month, so that you will get an idea about the development of the cyclone, the region impacted, and the naming, etc. factors thereby, but not required to jump from one cyclone to another. Now, having said that, coming back to the Conference of Parties number 29. So it ended up in a major disappointment with Indian representative issuing a very strong word that this was not something which was expected out of the developed nation. So let us understand what the scenario was and how it played out. So completely ignoring the demands of developing nation for the mobilization of funds, the developing nations, in order to combat the crisis of climate change which is upon them and upon the entire world. But the reality of the matter is that developing nations and underdeveloped nations are impacted more by climate change. Why is that? That is basically because here, these developing nations, they don't have the capability, they don't have the systems in order to combat the issue of climate change. For example, if you take a look at the climate change induced disasters in India, droughts, floods, cloudbursts, landslides, all of them which are indicated, more amount of tropical cyclones, for example, more frequent tropical cyclones which hit the eastern and the western coastline of our country. The losses caused every year, other than life and property, sum out to be in the tune of billions of dollars. So that is the same case across the world. So all the developing nations of the world, they wanted a large sum to be given out by the developed nations, and not only the sum to be given out, but how that money is given to the developing nations. So this is where the divergences prevail. So you see, the developing nations, they wanted a fund of $1.3 trillion, right? And that $1.3 trillion was the estimate that this will be sufficient to combat climate change and adapt to the issues of climate change. Go for clean energy mechanism, develop disaster resilient infrastructure, early warning systems, monitoring systems, IT infrastructure, supercomputers wherever they are required. But then the developed nations, it appears that they have been actually talking behind the scenes in a very close-chested meetings for the past 2 or 3 years, and they agreed upon the sum of $300 billion. And that $300 billion is considered to be grossly inadequate. Not only did India express its vociferous opposition to that amount of money, it was joined by countries like Nigeria, and India, being the voice and actually representing the voice of the global south, got a significant amount of support from the least developed nations and the small island groups as well. All of them termed it to be grossly inadequate. Now here, understand that this amount of money which will be handed over by the developed nation will not be handed tomorrow. It will be handed out when? It will be handed out from 2035. So you can imagine that 10 years down the line, the demand or the requirement of money will be much more. So when the requirement of money is much more, the developed nations are actually handing out close to around $300 billion, which is nothing. So that is where the disappointment arose. Now here, when we talk about the funding, so it was decided at the time of the Paris Agreement itself in 2015 that there has to be new cumulative quantitative goal, or NCQG, a financing mechanism whereby the countries will get that amount of money from the developed nations under the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Right? Now here, the amount of funding to be provided had to be decided before 2025. However, this new cumulative quantitative goal did not mention since when that money has to be deployed. It simply talked about the fact that whatever money you have to deploy, 100 rupees, 200 rupees, 300 rupees, 1000 rupees, whatever money the developed nations have to give, it has to be decided by 2025. Why? So that the developing nations can accordingly build their plans and accordingly build the disaster reduction plans, the climate change mitigation plans, adaptation plans, and so on. Now, based upon the assessment that the developing nations had carried out, they found out that they would require close to around $1.3 trillion every year. So in that phase of it, it is almost 1/4 and less than 1/4 of it. But there was another issue of divergence here. And that is, when you provide that funding, let's suppose a developed country provides that money, right? A developed nation provides funding, and that funding is given to the developing nation. Okay. Now, how do you provide that funding? If you provide that funding, let's suppose in the form of a loan, right? If you give that in the form of a loan, means what? Means the developing nation has to pay interest to that loan as well, isn't it? And overall, we can say that this developed nation is earning. So in a way, let's suppose I am, as an individual, I have to pay you some amount of money because of something that I owe you, right? Let's suppose I owe you around 10,000 rupees and you ask me that you owe me 10,000 rupees, give me 10,000. And I turn around and tell you, I will provide you 10,000, but I will provide you as a loan. So how does it help you? Right? So you will end up paying the interest, you will end up paying more money to me. So developed nations, they end up earning more with the help of these interests. So that is why the developing countries for a long time have been asking for this and have been vociferously expressing their opinion that this kind of money that the developed nations have to provide, that should be in the form of either grants, right? Grants as in no interest is required, no credit line is required, no kind of credit limit is there. So you simply provide that money as a kind of a help. You don't expect anything in return. Or if you are providing it in the form of a loan, provide it in a form of a concessionary loan, where the time period for repayment is relaxed, where the interest rates are very less. But the developed nations, smartly so, did not agree to do so. The developed nations diverge from that point of view. They say that we will provide you that money if required, but we will charge interest out of it. This is where the developing nations, they face a kind of a double whammy. One, the amount of money is less, and second, they have to pay back the interest. So how does it help the principle, or how does it vouch for the principle of CBDR? It simply violates the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. In a way, the developed nations which have gone through the path of economic development based on the emissions of greenhouse gases, they have not only destroyed the climate, but now in the name of helping, they are trying to earn that money back. So it is this violation which angered many of the developing and underdeveloped nations of the world. Right. Now here, let us summarize some of the key outcomes of the Conference of Parties 29 that is going to be relevant both for your prelims as well as the mains examination, because UPSC earlier has been known to ask direct question in the mains examination that what is the outcome of Conference of Parties number 26. So like that in the mains exam, UPSC can always ask you that question. So here, what were the key outcomes? First of all, the new collective quantified goal for climate finance. So that is an outcome. So it aims to triple the climate finance of the countries to the developing countries from the earlier $100 or rather $100 million to around $300 billion. So it is almost 3 times, from around $100 billion to around $300 billion. So that is a significant jump of 3 times, right? This is 100 billion. So that is where this is a kind of, if you can think about it, some outcome that it has tripled, but what was the expectation? That has not been met. Secondly, Conference of Parties reached an agreement to finalize the mechanism for carbon markets. What are carbon markets? Carbon markets are basically the emission trading platforms and emission trading mechanisms, whereby let's suppose any particular country, which is any developed country, which is unable to meet its target of emissions. Let's suppose this country has got this much target for emission. Let's suppose a country like Germany. Let's assume that Germany has got this level of target for emissions. But Germany has not been able to meet those targets, and it has significantly exceeded those targets. So what it can do, it can basically trade in those extra amount of carbon credits from some other country, or it can actually invest in a developing country like India in clean energy mechanisms. Clean energy mechanisms. Right. And after investing in clean energy mechanisms, India will give Germany credits, carbon credit. Now this carbon credit will come after investment of Germany in the clean energy market of India, so as to ensure that at least if Germany is unable to meet its carbon targets, India does not emit that much extra. So the aim is what? That overall across the planet, the emission should reduce. If I cannot reduce it, at least I will ensure that the other countries don't end up emitting more. So that is a carbon market mechanism for which there was a requirement for a global consensus. So that carbon market mechanism, as per Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, has been reached. Article 6.2 talks about country-to-country trading of carbon. Right, country-to-country trading of carbon. And Article 6.4 talks about a unified carbon market under the aegis of UN, where you can have the participation of the member nations and the organizations, and they can carry out the carbon trading. So overall aim of it is what? To reduce the overall amount of emissions. Reduce the amount of emissions. Okay. So that was the primary aim, and for that, thankfully, a consensus has been reached. Then methane emission. So basically, a kind of a carry forward of global methane treaty, which was arrived at Conference of Parties number 26 in Glasgow in 2021. Now, as a consequence or as a development of that, what is also referred to as a global methane pledge, the countries have carried that forward and have agreed to reduce the amount of methane emissions. You have to mind a particular fact that methane has got a substantial warming impact on the planet as well, on the climate as well. In fact, per molecule, methane has got a greater capability to warm the atmosphere as compared to carbon dioxide. So here, methane emissions, Conference of Party number 29, Declaration on Reducing Methane from Organic Waste. This is a build-up on Global Methane Pledge. This Global Methane Pledge was arrived at. Is India a member of it? Of the Global Methane Pledge? It was arrived at. This is also a kind of a question which is asked in the examination, that when was this particular pledge or initiative taken? Was it a consequence of the Conference of Parties number 29, or was it taken earlier? Was it taken in a different forum? So that is also a kind of a question there. So arrived at Conference of Parties number 26 in Glasgow, which was held in 2021. Okay, December 2021 was when this was arrived at. This was engineered by European Union and the US, and they brought the various different countries together, and the aim was to reduce the methane emissions by 30% by the year 2030. So that was the mission. And that was the aim. India is not a party of or party to the Global Methane Pledge. So for India, this does not count. Why is India not a member of the Global Methane Pledge or not a party to the Global Methane Pledge? Because of the fact that when we talk about India, the emissions of methane are quite significant from the agricultural sector, as is the case across the world. But in India, where paddy cultivation and such kind of cultivational practices which emit methane are very high, so any ban or any imposition of ban on this agricultural area can have a long-term detrimental impact in terms of what is the output and what is the overall outcome. So many of the farmers, many of the agricultural households have the potential to be impacted. However, at this Conference of Parties number 29, you had the declaration targets of the methane emissions, which contribute to 20% of the global methane emission. Right? Now here, you have the fact that this particular declaration on reducing methane, it focuses on 5 different priority areas. Nationally determined contribution, that has to include the aspect of methane. And when we say nationally determined contribution, we talk about what is the proportion that each country contributes in its own fight against climate change. As per the Paris Agreement, all the countries have to declare the measures, the steps that they will take in order to combat climate change. So they keep a cap in order to talk about how much amount of methane emission, greenhouse gas emission that they are going to carry. So in all the various different countries' agenda, in the NDCs, that talks about reducing the methane emission. Regulation of the emissions, data collection and data assimilation and data sharing is also very, very important, particularly when it comes to oil and energy sector. Whenever you extract oil or natural gas, whenever you process oil or natural gas, whenever you market oil and natural gas or you carry out the sale of it, at each of these stages, methane is emitted, and methane is quite significantly warming. Then finance required and partnerships from the public-private level. So all of that will be targeted to reduce the emissions. Now countries are encouraged to include the sectoral targets, that is, that in agriculture, what is your target to reduce the amount of emission? In energy sector, what is your target to reduce the emission? In transportation, what is your target for reducing the emission? So this sector-based target, that was not there in the initial Global Methane Pledge signed at Conference of Parties number 26. So this sectoral target was decided, and it builds upon the Global Methane Pledge to reduce global methane emissions by 30% by the year 2030, addressing methane from agriculture, waste, as well as the fossil fuels. So this is another kind of a positive outcome, even though India is not a member. Then it also adopted a Baku work plan to include the indigenous community and the local population in the fight against climate change. And that is where you had the Baku work plan, and that renewed the facilitative working group mandate under the local communities and indigenous people platform. You see, this LCIPP, that is local communities and indigenous people platform, this is a part, or this is a measure to include the local population, the indigenous population, in the fight against climate change. Because it has been understood that if you alienate the indigenous population, they have the knowledge of conservation of forested areas, they have the knowledge and inherent idea about conservation of wildlife, biodiversity, etc. So those indigenous population, you cannot alienate them when it comes to the climate change or protection of biodiversity. So that is why indigenous population, their knowledge, traditional knowledge, along with scientific systems and scientific analysis, that is sought to be a key kind of an intervention for the combat against climate change. Now here, this entire LCIPP, was this arrived at the Baku Conference of Party? No. This was arrived at Conference of Parties number 24, held in Poland, right? So it was arrived at a lot earlier. It was only renewed in Conference of Parties number 29. There is a renewal of the working group. Now that working group will coordinate with the local communities, indigenous population, forest dwellers in many parts, and ensure that the scientific system is submerged and dovetailed along with the local information. So that is the purpose associated. There is also a criteria for including the review of it, right? So review of the progress shall be held in 2027. This will give a stock-taking exercise and a stock-taking measure with regards to what has been the progress which has been made. Now then, for the farming sector, another new initiative has been arrived in cooperation and coordination with FAO, that is Food and Agriculture Organization. They have launched the Baku Harmonia Climate Initiative for farmers. Now this is to combat the issue of climate change, how they are impacting the farming community, right? To observe, right? Or to combat the impact of climate change, on agriculture. Because you see, agriculture is significantly suffering due to heat waves, due to floods, due to excess rainfall or scarcity of rainfall. Any outcome of climate change impacts agriculture significantly and quite strongly. And as a result of that, the farmers, the agricultural workers, they suffer from loss of income, along with the fact that it also endangers the nutritional and the food security of the various different nations. Because as the population is increasing, you need food to be available in greater amount. Food scarcity is something which cannot happen. So that is this initiative, what it is. A platform that brings together various different diverse landscapes of existing climate initiatives, because there are multiple climate initiatives which are going around, which have been launched after each and every conference of party. But oftentimes they don't end up meeting their strategic goals. Oftentimes they have a very diverse range of strategic goals. So initiatives in the field of food and agriculture to make the support for farmers easier and to facilitate access to finance. See and understand this. When we talk about climate resilient agriculture, as in you have to carry out the agricultural practices and cultivational practices where regardless of the changes in climate, your output is not impacted. That is climate resilient agriculture. So for climate resilient agriculture, what do you need? You need irrigation. You need better variety, drought resilient variety of seeds. Then you need what? You also need the availability of the various inputs, right? For example, due to the climate change, you have greater amount of pest attacks. Due to climate change, you have greater onset of diseases as well. So the farmers need to combat that. And for that, they require finances. Now, who will provide that finances? There are multiple initiatives which are launched. Let's combine all these initiatives in order to achieve that unified end goal of ensuring food security. That is where you have the aspect of Baku Harmonia Climate Initiative for farmers. That is the purpose and the role associated. Okay? Yes, it was launched in COP24 Katowice Summit. Very good, Ganesh. Beautiful. Right? Now, so these are basically some of the initiatives which have been arrived at Baku. So a quick summarization, let me tell you what are the various different agreements arrived at. So first of all, if you take a look at it, funding, right? Funding, which has tripled in value. Earlier it was $100 billion. Now it is $300 billion per year, right? To be deployed from 2035. Now, is this sufficient? No. What was the expectation of the developing nations? It was $1.3 trillion. Right? But it is $300 billion. That funding has been arrived at. Other than that, the aspect of methane emission has been worked upon, reducing the methane emissions, forwarding the agenda of global methane pledge, reducing the emissions by ensuring that the countries fix sectoral targets, right? So as a part of global methane pledge, concentrating upon financing, cooperation, data sharing, declaration of NDCs, etc. India is not a part of this agreement. Then indigenous communities or indigenous population, right, and their role. For that, assessment will be held in 2027, review in 2027, right? And then Baku Harmonia Initiative for Farmers. Initiative for Farmers. Okay? These are the key outcomes. Right? So that is what you have to retain, be it for the prelims or be it for the mains examination. Okay? Now, after this, we move on to the second topic, and that is the Global Plastics Treaty. Now, Global Plastics Treaty has also been in news because various different countries, they have failed to arrive at a consensus with regards to plastic ban. And you have to understand that the international organizations, or rather the international bodies, they are trying to coerce the countries, or they are trying to nudge the countries to arrive at a consensus that plastic usage should not be there, owing to the fact that plastic waste is increasing year after year. Millions of metric tons of plastic waste are generated every year, and the amount of waste generated is expected to increase with every passing year. So that is where the expectation was that multiple series of negotiations have happened. Latest series of negotiations were being held in South Korea. But owing to the differences, the countries could not arrive at a consensus. India also did not agree to sign that treaty. So there is a failure or a kind of a breakdown in talks. However, the various different countries are expected to meet again next year under the aegis of INC5 so that there can be some amount of consensus. So here we will concentrate upon what is the aspect of Global Plastics Treaty, the initiatives taken by India in order to combat the plastic pollution in our country, and also what were the areas of divergences and why is it that it is required to arrive at the treaty. So first of all, the context why we are discussing this and why this has been in news. So delegates from around 170 countries met in Busan for that negotiation in order to arrive at a consensus to ban plastic. Now, these are the countries which are, the entire initiative is something which is led by countries like Norway and many of the European countries in order to ban the plastic and plastic waste, because as I told you, due to bioaccumulation, biomagnification, this plastic waste is reaching into the food chain, into various organisms and causing a long-term damage. They are also able to create dead zones in various different oceans. They disintegrate as microbeads and they remain in the biological system for a long period of time. And because plastic does not degrade very quickly, and plastic is something which can burn very easily, so oftentimes the waste dumps that you see across the various parts of the world, for example, in India itself, you take a look at it. In India, various waste dumps that you have, they contain very thin plastic pieces as well. Now, in days of extreme heat, these plastics can catch fire very easily along with the dried twigs, clothes, etc. which are placed. And that can give rise to wildfires in the waste dumps, which again is very polluting and releases poisonous gases. Right. So here, that is why the problem of plastic is quite significant. But the countries failed to agree on the framework agreement to eliminate plastic pollution. Right. A resolution, how this all started. So in 2022, at the sidelines of UN Environment Assembly, which was held in Nairobi, that was aimed to establish the rules to curb the plastic waste. But then multiple rounds of negotiation, this was the 5th round of international negotiation which was happening. So after all these negotiations, it was expected that by the end of this year, the world will arrive at a consensus. But that did not happen. So what were the sticking points? First was the push to have the countries set targets to cut virgin polymer production. Now here, this was opposed by oil-producing nations, right? Opposed by oil-producing nations. Why? Because when we talk about oil-producing nations, these nations, they use that petrochemical or petroleum products in order to produce plastic. Plastic does utilize the input of petroleum and petrochemical products. So all these oil-producing nations, for example, like Saudi Arabia, now they have a significant amount of money which comes their way by the sale and the production of these virgin polymer plastics which are there. So that is why they will be impacted. But also when it comes to countries like India, we also produce significant amount of plastic and we export some of that produce as well. So India also did not agree for a significant amount of targeted ban or a targeted production on this kind of virgin polymer plastic. Why? Because India expressed its own reservations that if India reduces the amount of production, it can impact its overall economy, right? So opposition by India as well. Opposed by India as well. Why? Because of the concerned with the impact on economy. Impact on economy. Right. So that was a kind of a major concern. This is where basically the countries did not agree. Various different nations have pushed for the fact that limit the target, but the other countries are not agreeing to that. Other than that, you also had the draft version for the kind of agreement or the consensus which talked about year-wise targets. That is a kind of a phase targeted reduction of plastic production, and including single-use plastic, toys and food products which contain some of the chemicals and some of the types of plastic like dibutyl, phthalate, benzyl butyl, etc. All of these which are being contained in that plastic product, their utility has to be curbed. This is also one of the sticking points where the countries simply did not agree. So because of these two sticking points, the Global Plastic Treaty could not become a reality. But if you take a look at the quick background of this entire treaty, then it turns out to be a kind of a long endeavor, right? And another sticking point, by the way, was the fact that many nations, they wanted a kind of a complete life cycle ban. That is, plastic has got various different stages in its life, from production, consumption, and then eventually waste disposal. Isn't it? So if you take care of the pollution or the lower amount of production, if you ensure that the consumption is less, then automatically waste generation will also be less and waste management can also be possible. So that is where many countries were aiming for that let's attack the entire life cycle of plastic if we want to get rid of the plastic waste and the plastic pollution. But then here also, many of the countries diverged or were quite significantly varied in their opinion. And many different countries, they thought about it that the focus should only be on the plastic waste. Focus should not be on production, because with production, you have the economy which is linked, right? But here you can have an argument on both sides of the picture that if you don't limit the production, the waste will keep on piling. Regardless of howsoever you augment the waste management facilities, these waste management facilities will turn out to be incapable in terms of ensuring that more plastic does not end up in oceans or land degraded sites. So that is why production and consumption has to be limited, because otherwise every year millions of metric tons of plastic will end up in the biological systems as well. Okay, so these three were the sticking points. First sticking point, a quick summarization. What was the first sticking point? About the production of virgin polymer products. Second, the designated step-by-step target. There also countries could not agree. And third, whether to attack the full life cycle of plastic or whether to restrict yourself only with the waste management, the plastic waste and the management of that, right? Now, a background about the entire treaty. So here, the UN Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or INC, as it is referred to, Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. So this was established by the United Nations Environment Assembly to develop a legally binding international instrument to address plastic waste and the plastic pollution and its impact on marine environments. And as you can see, now the meeting in South Korea in Busan completes the 5 different meetings of Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee which has been held, and a final consensus still is not arrived at. So first meeting was held in Uruguay, the second one in France, third one in Kenya, fourth one in Canada, and latest in South Korea. It is expected that next year you will have another one of these meetings, another try and another effort by the global community to arrive at a consensus which is acceptable to all. Now, this on the face of the fact that India in itself has been taking various different measures in order to combat the issue of plastic waste and the plastic pollution. What are the various measures that India has been taking? First of all, single-use plastic ban. Right? Those kinds of plastic which can be used only once. So those kind of plastics not to be used significantly, and banning the utility of those plastics, that is a significant step. Now, even though the execution, the implementation has not happened successfully in majority of the states due to lack of any alternate packaging material or alternate viable option, but still this is a step in the right direction. And then other than that, what is the other measure that India has taken? So here India has taken or carried out the plastic waste management, right? Management Amendment 2022. Under this, what India has carried out, what India has done is basically India has introduced the market mechanism in terms of plastic waste management as well, right? So there are multiple measures that India has taken. First, under this very stringent or extended producer responsibility, stringent EPR norms. EPR basically means extended producer responsibility, where the producer is held liable and responsible to ensure that the plastic wastes are taken care of. And the plastic waste which are generated, for example, let's suppose Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is producing soft drinks, but that soft drink is packaged in a plastic bottle. As a consumer, if you consume Coca-Cola, now you have a plastic waste in your hand. And that plastic waste, if you throw, that again becomes a nature's problem. So that is when Coca-Cola is responsible as an organization to handle that amount of plastic waste. That is the concept of extended producer responsibility, which has to be taken care of. So this is a stringent EPR norm which has been discussed as per, or which has been devised as per plastic waste management norms. And then introduction of market mechanism. What is that market mechanism? Whereby you have tradable certificates, just like the carbon credits. Carbon credits can be traded from one region to another. Just like that, here you have the inception of tradable certificates. Certificates for what? Certificates for plastic waste management. For example, an individual or organization has got a specialization in managing the plastic waste. That individual organization can take a look at the waste management of plastic in a particular municipality, in a particular region. Now, let's suppose they have taken a look at and taken care of all the plastic waste generated around the region of Delhi NCR. Now, tomorrow, if an organization like Samsung, if an organization like Pepsi or Coca-Cola, if they have to meet their targets, what they can do is basically buy these certificates from these organizations so as to ensure that there is an efficient mechanism and efficient management which can take place. So that is where the concept of the tradable certificates come into place. Other than that, the portal-based management, registration and reporting and monitoring mechanisms were developed, isn't it? This reporting and monitoring mechanism was developed that any producer, any importer, any registered owner of that plastic product, that is the organizations that are there, these organizations need to put in a portal the amount of plastic that they are producing or the amount of plastic that they are reselling, like that. And that portal is something which will be managed by CPCB. Managed by CPCB. Central Pollution Control Board, formed in 1974 as a consequence of the Water Act. So, other than that, there are various other initiatives that India has taken, like Project Replan, etc. Mission Life, which talks about sustainable consumption patterns. So there are multiple different steps that India has taken. So India is serious about that plastic waste. But then there are certain aspects where India cannot risk the impact on its economic systems and the economic output of many of the small scale and micro level industries and MSMEs which operate for the manufacturing of these plastic products. So that is where India doesn't want the impact to be very stringent, and that is why the hesitancy in signing the treaty. Now, need for a plastic treaty. Why is there is a need for arriving at a plastic treaty? The need is significant and the need is quite apparent. So what is that need? We know that first of all, plastics do not degrade, non-degradable or decomposable waste. So they end up remaining in the system or in the ecosystem for a very long period of time, right? So as a result, contamination of the food chains or the food webs, contamination of the food web. Now, how does that contamination of the food web happen? By the process of bioaccumulation, accumulation, and biomagnification, right? Then, in the marine environment, they create dead zones. Dead zones are created in the marine ecosystem. They end up preventing the air-water interface in the oceanic areas. It is that air-water interface which enriches the water body with dissolved oxygen, which is very much required by the species in order to carry out respiration. So that is where these dead zones will impact a lot of marine biodiversity as well. Then, like that, its impact is quite significant. Waste disposal systems are clogged, and waste disposal systems overall are impacted by due to the inability to handle these waste. So there is a growing need to arrive at that plastic treaty. So what is the way forward? The way forward has to be a kind of an economically viable alternative, where let's suppose those countries which are suffering due to the plastic production, now there needs to be some amount of compensation, or there needs to be some kind of, let's suppose, a stepped up target, right? That you don't immediately ban the production, but maybe 20 or 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, you can halt the production. For that, there needs to be a technical assistance, technological transfer of know-how with regards to what are the alternative packaging mechanisms, and also newer materials which are required. Funding assistance can be provided to the developing nations and underdeveloped nations as well, so that they can come on board. Because tomorrow, all of a sudden, if you say that you cannot use plastics anymore, now, what do you use in place of that? Paper bags don't have that much amount of carrying capacity. The thicker paper bags which have that carrying capacity are much more expensive than the plastic. Jute bag which has that carrying capacity is much more expensive. So that cannot be used by retail sellers in the lower grade economic system. So that is why you need an alternative mechanism. For that, technology needs to be developed. So these are some of the aspects which can be observed going ahead, right? So again, in summarization, what is it that we have discussed here? The reasons why the Global Plastics Treaty could not be arrived at. What were the reasons? Three main sticking points. First sticking point, the immediate targeted reduction or the ban on the virgin polymer plastics which is produced. That was opposed by oil producing nations and countries like India. Second, a targeted reduction by the year 2040 for the various different types of plastic products which are there. Third, attacking the life cycle of the plastic or only waste management. Then we have seen what is that intergovernmental negotiating committee that was arrived at United Nations Environment Assembly, which was held in Nairobi in 2022. Now, there have been 5 meetings of INC till now. Next year, there is expected to be INC 5.2 meeting, which is going to be there. Then we have taken a look at the steps, the initiatives that have been taken by India in order to combat plastic pollution and plastic waste, and also why is there a need for a plastic treaty and what is the way forward which can be adopted. Okay. Now, the Global High Seas Treaty. So basically, India has signed the BBNJ agreement, that is Biodiversity Beyond Natural Jurisdiction, what is also referred to as the Treaty of the High Seas or the High Seas Treaty, in order to take care of the biodiversity in the high seas. What are those high seas? We will take a look into it. But even after India signing this, there are a significant amount of reservations whether this particular treaty will be a success or whether the framing of the treaty in itself is so flawed that even if it comes into force, maybe that might not achieve the desired result. So here, what is the context? India's recent signing of BBNJ agreement, known as the High Seas Treaty, has drawn both praise and skepticism from marine or the maritime observers. So first of all, what is that High Seas Treaty? And before that, what do we understand by the high seas? So as per United Nations Conventional Law on Seas, UN clause, you will find that is UN clause, United Nations Convention Law on Seas. As per UN clause, the coastal waters, they are designated as different parts and different regions. So here, from the region of the coastal area to the baseline or the shoreline, that is the internal water within the jurisdiction of the country. Then extending up till 12 nautical miles from the baseline, you have the territorial waters, again where the jurisdiction of the country extends. Then 24 nautical miles from the baseline is the contiguous zone. 200 nautical miles from the baseline is the exclusive economic zone, where the country has got all the rights for economic exploitation, be it the fishing activities, be it mineral exploration, be it the mineral exploitation. For example, let's suppose 100 nautical miles from the coastline you find oil reserves. As a country, you have the right to explore and extract that kind of oil. So it is an exclusive economic zone associated with that country. Beyond that exclusive economic zone, that is the region which is known as the high seas, and that is the region which is also referred to as simply many of the times the area. Okay, this is also what is referred to as the area. Now across the globe, you have significant amount of these zones which are there, that is high seas. So coastal waters you can protect. You can have maritime protected areas or marine protected areas in the coastal waters. The countries will be held responsible and accountable for the management. But when we talk about the larger ocean, in larger ocean, many species are killed. Mineral exploration is happening. Many long-term pollutants are released into the ocean. There is significant amount of impact on the oceanic biodiversity. So that is why the High Seas Treaty is aimed at protecting all those threats and protecting the oceans from those threats and ensuring that there will be a kind of a conservation measure initiated. Right. What is virgin plastic? It is the newly produced plastic rather than reduced and reused and recycled. It is the newer plastic which is produced. Okay. Now, yes, the Plastic Waste Management Rule 2016 was amended in 2022. That is where you had these changes which were brought about. More stringent EPR norms, etc. These were the changes brought about. So that is the need, coming back to it, that is the need for the High Seas Treaty. Having said that, this High Seas Treaty, if you take a look at the background, how it was arrived at, it is a kind of a work which has been in progress for more than decades now. So here, idea of protecting the marine environment emerged way back in 2002, when the world realized that conservation of biodiversity is something should not be restricted only to the territorial regions or only immediately to the coastal areas. After all, a significantly varied biodiversity lives in the deeper part of the ocean, which is under no jurisdiction. Under no one's jurisdiction means what? Everybody in a way is free to exploit and explore. And that can have a long-term detrimental impact on the viability and the survivability of the biodiversity itself. So by 2008, the need for implementing an agreement was recognized, which led to the UNGA resolution in 2015. Committee recommended the intergovernmental conferences to be held, and after 5 prolonged negotiations, treaty was adopted in 2023. However, the treaty has not come into force yet. It was agreed, it was signed, it has not come into force. Why? The treaty will come into force after 60 countries have ratified the agreement. Ratification of the agreement means what? Ratification basically means that you agree to uphold the international law and accountable to the international norms. So 60 countries, after they have ratified, after that, after 120 days of that is when the treaty comes into force. Okay. But as of now, what is the problem? As of now, only 14 countries have ratified that. Have ratified. So you can imagine what a long way to go. Various different countries hold reservations against the treaty as well. So what are the reservations? What are the sticking points? Let us take a look into that. So here, first of all, the aim of the treaty. What is the aim of the treaty? The aim is to address the issues associated with the conservation of biodiversity and impacting the overall marine environment, like increasing sea temperature, overexploitation of the biodiversity, overfishing, coastal pollution, dumping of the solid waste, the municipal waste into the coastal waters, unsustainable practices beyond the national jurisdiction, whatever is happening, like whaling, oil exploration, mineral exploitation, extraction of polymetallic nodules, methane hydrates from the South China Sea, all of that has to be curbed. And the aim or a way to do that is to conserve the biodiversity, or the aim to do that is to conserve the biodiversity. So the aims basically are to establish marine protected areas for conservation, to preserve the marine genetic resources. And these genetic resources, there the benefit and the sharing with the local community will also, or is something which is also envisaged. Then environmental impact assessment has to be carried out for any project which is carried out or which is enforced. Any project, be it mineral exploration, be it, let's suppose, establishing a kind of a shipping lane or shipping products out there, everything needs an environmental impact assessment. Then capacity building and technology transfer as well to the smaller nations in order to ensure a greater amount of preservation. So this is the aim. However, there are multiple sticking points and multiple challenges due to which this is not being enforced. What are the sticking points? As of now, only 14 countries have ratified the treaty. So it is still very far away from being implemented. Then disputes over maritime territories in South China Sea. So the various nations in the region of South China Sea, they have a fear, they have a lingering reservation that if, let's suppose, we ratify the treaty, we declare marine protected areas. Now, by declaration of marine protected region in the South China Sea, will it dilute our claim of South China Sea? Because various different countries, they have induced or they have put a claim to the extent under their control in South China Sea. That is the main reason for the dispute in South China Sea. So there is a reservation that if, let's suppose, after ratification of the treaty, a large marine protected area is declared, it will be under whose jurisdiction? How will we be able to manage that? That is where they are hesitant to ratify that. And also, there is a fear. For example, if, let's suppose, you declare a particular coastal region as a marine protected area. Now, in that marine protected area, can fishing be carried out? If yes, to what extent can fishing be carried out? Obviously, there will be limitations in the amount of fish catch, the methods of fishing, etc. Right? So, after you have declared a coastal area or a water body as a marine protected area, after that, it might very well be possible that you are unable to ensure livelihood earning to the fishermen. The fisher folk, they might suffer, their livelihood might suffer. So that is another kind of an impact, another kind of a disadvantage or a reservation that the countries have. Then other than that, marine genetic resources. Now, the treaty obligates the various different nations who are a party to the treaty to share the profits derived from exploiting these resources through a global fund. Right? that share it with the global fund. And that global fund will ensure that the local communities are given the benefit out of it. Now, for a brief moment, think about it. When you talk about small island nations in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, etc. Now, these small island nations, if they want to carry out any kind of activity in the ocean that they have considered as their resource, they have to share the amount of money to a global fund. Now, as is the reputation of the global fund, like the Global Environment Facility, etc., the countries are not very optimistic that they will be given their fair share. They have a significant amount of reservation that small island nations, they won't be able to enforce the amount of money that they deserve. It can happen that developed countries tomorrow, they simply decline to share that money. What will you do then? That is where they are reluctant to sign. Then capacity building and technology transfer is also a sticking point. That is there going to be a technology transfer? If not, then the smaller countries will lose out. Then lax enforcement mechanisms. In the entire treaty, there is no such stringent enforcement mechanism which binds the developed nations. After all, the smaller nations, they fear the developed nations because the developed nations are known to exploit and circumvent the realities of the treaty. Any international treaty, they simply jeopardize the treaty for their own national interest, and that is the reservation that the smaller nations have. But other than that, there are certain very inherently systemic issues in the framing of the treaty itself, where the treaty, in a way, it gives you an idea that even after it is ratified, it might not achieve the end goal. It might still fall short of the target. Right. So here, it only focuses upon the issue of the high seas. Now here, if you apply logic, if you want to conserve the biodiversity and protect the region of the biodiversity in the high seas, are high seas an isolated quantity or an isolated entity? No. Let's suppose in this exclusive economic zone, you carry out the construction of oil rigs, you extract oil. Now that pollutant, will it stay within the exclusive economic zone? Will it be the case that no, high seas treaty is arrived, now the pollutant won't move to the high seas? Obviously not. They are merged. So if you don't have any mechanism to protect the pollution in exclusive economic zone, how can you protect the high seas? It works on the presumption that each of the countries will be responsible enough in order to manage the pollution in exclusive economic zone. But the reality of the matter is that the exclusive economic zones, they are treated in isolation and the high seas are treated in isolation. It will never have a kind of a long-lasting fruit which can be yielded. Right? Then, reluctance of the coastal states to assume responsibility for whatever activities happen in their waters. Right? The coastal states, they are not ready to bear that responsibility. That, okay, overfishing can happen, pollution can happen. Now that pollution can lead to high seas as well. Right? Then when we talk about environmental impact assessment, while the High Seas Treaty talks about the fact that any kind of activity, if you want to carry in the high seas, you have to ensure there is an EIA, environmental impact assessment, which is carried out. But the problem with that is that the entire treaty stays silent on the oil and gas sector owing to the pressure by the oil nations and the rich nations. Now, oil and gas, the exploration, the extraction, the entire process is so polluting, it can pollute the high seas as well. But here, the treaty does not talk about it. So that is a lacuna. Now, disinclination of the states to accept an international review of the EIA. The very purpose of environmental impact assessment will be fulfilled when you have neutral observers ensuring that the environmental impact assessment is carried out with full neutrality, with full independence. But here, that means you can have a kind of compromised entities or vested interest carrying out this EIA and generating reports out of their own will. So that means the entire system can be rigged, the entire system can be played with. So this is again another one of the systemic issues which are faced. So these are some of the issues. Kanishak, can you please explain how the dispute in South China Sea is a challenge? You see, I hope you can see the map in the background. Now, if you consider the region of the South China Sea here, roughly, now here, if the Treaty of the High Seas comes into implementation, High Seas means what? Beyond the exclusive economic zone. So under that, in those high seas, you end up designating and end up conceptualizing marine protected areas. So here, let's suppose tomorrow a marine protected area is established. Now, a country like Philippines claims this much of South China Sea as a part of its own. Let's suppose China considers the entire South China Sea as a part of its own. Now, once you declare it as a protected area, what will happen to that territorial claim? That is dicey. That is where the countries are basically reluctant. That after declaring that as a protected area, who will take care of that protected area? Which entity will take care of that protected area? That is where the fear is that they will lose their claim over the South China Sea and other disputed areas and other disputed territories as well. So what is the way forward for this? Okay, I hope Kanishak this is understood. So what is the way forward for this? Way forward is very simple. First of all, the countries need to realize there is a greater awareness which is required about the urgency of the treaty. Because the global seas, they are under increased stress, a kind of a stress which has been unparalleled for the past many 100,000 years almost. And that is where a global awareness is required. Secondly, the aspect of environmental impact assessment, that needs to be further clarified, right? Thirdly, the kind of responsibility that the coastal states need to take, that needs to be ensured. You cannot treat the region of EEZ, exclusive economic zone, in complete isolation with the high seas. They have to be taken in a kind of a merged quantity and a merged entity. Only then will you be able to conserve that. Okay, so even when you talk about access and benefit sharing to the local population and the local community, the global fund, who will be the trustee of that global fund, that is also where there needs to be a confidence building measure for the smaller countries involved. So these are some of the way forward. So here, if you have to conceptualize and summarize the way forward, first of all, there needs to be a consensus, right, about the need of the treaty, right? This is one of the first arguments and the first requirements. Then secondly, EEZ and high seas cannot be treated in isolation. Okay, they cannot be treated in isolation. Then thirdly, when you talk about, let's suppose the coastal states have to bear responsibility for the coastal water. Then after that, the environmental impact assessments, they need to be comprehensive and neutral. And how do you ensure that? You need to carry out a kind of an exercise of international review and monitoring, right? Comprehensive and monitored. Then genetic resources, marine genetic resources. For that, has to be shared with the smaller nations or the nations involved directly. Shared with nations involved, rather than the money piling up in a global trust, which can be exploited by the developed nation. Tomorrow, if let's suppose any of the small island nation doesn't agree with the policy of US or the policy of a developed European country, they might impose a sanction and they might withhold the funds that the small islands they deserve. So that is where they have to be shared with the nations involved directly. Right. So these are some of the measures. If they are taken into consideration, then this Global High Seas Treaty can be considered to be a true success. The requirement of it is very high. Okay. Now, the World Drought Atlas. Now, this World Drought Atlas was released by United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, that is UNCCD. UNCCD was a kind of a convention which was arrived when? It was arrived at in 1992, again as a consequence of the Rio Summit, held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1992. It was the same convention where United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was arrived at. It is the same meeting and the same summit where you had the the agreement on Convention on Biological Diversity. So UNCCD has come up with the World Drought Atlas, and that talks about the fact that 75% of the population will be affected by drought by the year 2050. Now, who has come up with this Drought Atlas? That is important for your prelims examination. So here, it was launched by UNCCD, European Commission Joint Research Center. Both of these have launched this atlas, right? Other than that, there are multiple other organizations, independent bodies, NGOs, which have also been involved in this. So co-produced by the Simmer Research Foundation, Italy. Like that, you have various different organizations which are involved, but majorly these two are something that you have to retain for your prelims examination. Now here, when we talk about drought, you see, drought is of various types. Drought basically means literally a scarcity of water as a resource. You don't have enough availability of water as a resource. So there are 4 different types of droughts which occur. One is what is referred to as agricultural droughts. Agricultural drought basically means that the soil becomes so very dry due to lack of rainfall for a prolonged period that it is unable to sustain plant growth and unable to sustain the growth of crops. That is what is the agricultural drought involved. Okay. Now, this agricultural drought can be damaging. It can lead to crop failures. In India, we suffer from this agricultural drought quite frequently, where you do observe the loss of income and the loss of food products at the hand of the farmers, and the farmers oftentimes they suffer such insurmountable losses that they get involved in debt traps, right? They take loans in order to repay the earlier loans and so on. Then, other than that, socio-economic drought. Now here, overall, there is a water scarcity for drinking purposes, for domestic usages, etc. Now, this is a kind of a drought which hits the regions like Karnataka, areas of Vidarbha in eastern Maharashtra, Telangana. These states, they are very frequently impacted by socio-economic droughts as well. Then you have hydrological drought, where the streams, they begin to dry up. The water bodies, they begin to dry up. Right. Now, this drought can be significantly long-lasting as well, unless and until you have the regular availability of rainfall. And then you have meteorological drought, which is in one particular area where for a long time rainfall has not happened. The climatic factors have led to this kind of impact. Now, these are the 4 different types of drought. Now, you see, all these droughts majorly are impacted due to climate conditions, but also anthropogenic or human activities. Human activities are significantly responsible for the drought. For example, lack of vegetation in an area means what? The water does not stay. If let's suppose you have the ground surface. Now, if you have a region which has got trees, significant amount of trees, let's suppose. Now these trees will have their roots penetrating deeper into the grounds. Right. Now, if this region receives slightest amount of rainfall or rainwater, all that rainwater will percolate and the soil will hold that. But on the other hand, if you have barren land and there you have rainfall, the water will quickly drain away on the surface, leading to dry conditions, the water getting drained away. So that is where you have the impact which is observed, right? So that is basically where vegetation, changing land use pattern, all of that significantly impacts that, right? Lack of water storage structures, all of that creates drought-like conditions. Now, the report studies the effect of droughts on energy, trade and agriculture. This is where the report has talked about the fact that in a country like India, the agricultural loss is quite significant. For example, in Maharashtra, soybean is one of those agricultural products which has suffered from immense amount of loss due to lack of rainfall. In Karnataka, again, earlier this year, due to lack of rainfall for almost 4 to 5 months, many of the crop failures have been experienced. So that is where impact on agriculture is quite substantial. So what are the factors? Climate change is one of those factors. The climate change brings about changing rainfall pattern, okay, due to which either you have excess rainfall in one day followed by prolonged dry spell. That means always there is going to be some or the other kind of water scarcity or water deficiency. Then anthropogenic factors such as unsustainable water use. This is human-induced factors. Okay. So here, how the water is managed in between the different sectors like industry, like agriculture, like domestic usage, there is a gross mismanagement. Moreover, you don't have enough data, right, regarding where the water is being used, how much water is being received, how much water is being consumed. India does not have data, as is the case with the rest of the world. If you want to get a cure of any problem, first thing that you need to do is have an idea about where that loss of water is happening, and data sharing is required. That is not happening. Then poor land management, in the sense that the land use pattern is changing, in the sense that whichever regions have been forested, now they are turning into urban landscapes or they are turning into degraded landscapes. Now that means water retention capability of the soil reduces, but also the water cycle gets impacted. Because if you have a lot of vegetation, that area will always receive rainfall. Due to the water cycle, that is evapotranspiration, the region will always receive rainfall. It is only when you have none of those trees available, none of those vegetation available, you only have a concrete jungle of an urban space, that is when all that water continues to get drained away. So poor land management and not properly accounting for water resources, that basically means lack of data. Data accrual also and data sharing as well, right? Data is not collected and data sharing. So this is the significant impact. Now, or the reason for the drought. Now, what is the impact on India? Every year you have crop failures. For example, in the past couple of years, we have been observing that due to the kind of extreme heat, there has been a crop failure of wheat happening in northwestern part of India. Then we have observed the failure of the crop of cotton. Then recently soybean, right? So you have had crop failures in the regions or in the crops like wheat, due to which India had to impose a wheat export ban. Then soybean, cotton, etc. Right? So there has been crop failures, which means loss of agricultural income. Loss of agricultural income will lead to what? Rural distress. Rural distress basically will lead to what? Loss of demand in the rural economy, and that can have a cascading impact on the overall economic setup. Then there is water scarcity. Majority of the urban areas of the country, for example, Bengaluru, if you consider Bengaluru, it has suffered a substantial scarcity of drinking water supply for the first half of the year, where you had the larger section of the population being completely dependent on the tankers, water tankers, etc. for the availability of water, availability of drinking water. So that is the water scarcity issue. Issues associated with water sharing. When you don't have enough rainfall, rivers won't carry that much amount of water. There will be hydrological drought. That means there will be water sharing disputes which will come to the fore. Earlier this year itself, you would have seen that in the case of Delhi, now even the Himalayan states, they are suffering from water scarcity. You would have seen that the Minister for Water Resources in Delhi, she had to sit on a dharna, right, for water sharing. Similarly, you have water sharing disputes which keep on coming to the surface between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. Why is that? If the abundant amount of water and rainfall would be available, these controversies, these disputes would never have existed. But it is because of the drought impact. Overall, the socio-economic condition, right, the hydrological condition, the biodiversity, the natural ecosystem, everything is impacted. Food security, everything is impacted. In many of the regions, the dams and the reservoirs are responsible for generation of hydroelectricity. Now, if the dams do not have enough water supply, will there be energy production? Absolutely not. So it can lead to energy scarcity, water scarcity, food scarcity, economic deprivation, and the list goes on and on. People are forced to consume contaminated water due to the lack of proper water supply, which means what? People will be exposed to various different types of waterborne diseases, various different types of contaminated diseases as well. So the health will be impacted as well, right? So there are various different types of impacts, multiple different types of impacts which can be observed. Okay, so here you have to include the aspects of health, energy scarcity, right? I hope that is understood how and why. Water scarcity we have already mentioned, food scarcity, economic deprivation, all of that will be the outcome. So what is the way forward? What is the way forward here? So this is particularly an article which is there from Down to Earth. And Down to Earth basically has talked about this particular drought atlas. And here UNCCD has enumerated certain measures which can be taken in order to combat the issue of drought. First, better accumulation of data. That is the need of the hour, right? Then second, developing early warning systems that a drought is about to occur. Lalita, how drought leads to water sharing issues. See, there are various different types of droughts, my dear. One of the drought is the hydrological drought. Hydrological drought means what? Hydrological drought basically means that the streams and the rivers, they start getting dry. Streams and rivers dry. Isn't it? When the streams and the rivers, they dry up. So let's suppose you consider two states, two of the bordering states. Now, if there is a river which is flowing from here into this state, now if there would have been enough water, both the states would have sufficient water supply. But let's suppose a situation where the stream is drying up. Then the first state will always think about utilizing as much water as they can. That will give the second state the reason to worry that now I am not getting enough water. So that is where you will always have a dispute between the two states that I need more water, you are holding more water, and that is where the lack of rainfall or the lack of water can lead to the water sharing dispute. If you apply logic here, majority of the water sharing disputes which are there in the country, the river water sharing disputes, majority of the disputes are where? In the peninsular part of the country. Himalayan states have started jumping into the queue very recently, but majority of the water sharing dispute is in the case of Godavari, in the case of Narmada, in the case of Krishna, in the case of Kaveri, and so on. Now, why is that the case? Because peninsular rivers are completely dependent on rainfall itself. Any variation in rainfall means the availability of water for the downstream states is impacted. That means the agrarian economy in those states get impacted. That means overall population gets impacted, right? Now, then investment in research and monitoring systems, better kind of development of mechanisms to monitor the onset of drought and the occurrence of the drought, sustainable agricultural practices, more crop per drop, drip irrigation, sprinkler irrigation rather than going for flood irrigation in many areas, growing the kind of crop which the climate of the region allows. For example, Punjab, Haryana and Western UP, they are not suitable for cultivation of paddy as a crop. Paddy or rice requires around 120 to 140 centimeter of rainfall annually, right, per year. Punjab region of Haryana, the Punjab region, the Haryana region and Western UP region, the ideal bowls of Green Revolution, all of these states, how much rainfall do they receive? Around 50 to 70 centimeter per year. So how do they make up for this loss or this deficiency or this gap? They exploit the groundwater. They over extract the river water. That is where the groundwater is drying up. So rather than this, grow vegetables, grow millets, grow pulses, so that the soil also maintains its fertility, maintains its moisture, and you are not draining all of that moisture. But these states, they continue to grow that. Rice ideally should be grown where? Eastern part of India, southern part of India. Southern part of India receives that much amount of rainfall adequate for rice cultivation, adequate for sugarcane cultivation. Sugarcane is still being cultivated in Punjab. Sugarcane is another one of those crops which requires high amount of rainfall. So all of that is done on the backdrop of what? That we will be able to exploit the groundwater more and more. So that is unsustainable agricultural practice. Then soil conservation measures have to be put into place by promoting more vegetation so that percolation of water can happen, penetration of water to the lower levels, where a recharge of the groundwater can happen. Then adaptation measures in order to combat and how to adapt with drought. Community-based approach of water conservation, water harvesting systems to be deployed. So all of that is required if we really want to combat drought, or we are staring at a substantial water scarcity. This year, for example, Bengaluru was an ideal example where despite all the lofty buildings and the costly apartments that you see, the IT hub of the country developing, people were left wondering whether they will have enough water supply or not. Many of the affluent societies depended on the tanker water supply. Situation will worsen year after year as the issue of climate change exaggerates. That is why there is a requirement of the way out. And that is something which has been provided as a sneak peek by United Nations Convention on United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the World Drought Atlas that they have issued. That detailed study does talk about what can be done. Okay. Now, after that, Asian Development Bank signs a $98 million loan for Clean Plant Program. That is the Atmanirbhar Clean Plant Program. What is that? So basically, this is a program which was announced in the budget sometime back last year itself. You had the announcement in the budget. Now, what is that entire program about? The program is to support the horticultural produce and the horticultural farmers, right? Horticultural as in the fruits and vegetables. Now, due to climate change, as we have already talked about, the incidence of pest attacks, diseases, etc. is increasing even in the case of horticultural crops. So that is where you need to provide support to the farmers. You need to support the horticultural produce as well. After all, that horticultural product, vegetable, fruits, etc., that is going to yield more amount of money. That is going to yield more amount of revenue as well. So that is where the support is envisaged. Now, the government of India and the Asian Development Bank signed a $98 million loan to improve horticulture crop farmers' access to certified disease-free planting materials, right? Which will increase the yield of the crops, the quality, which will give better economic value, and resilience to the climate impact. This is for the economic upliftment of the farming community. Now, why is there a need for it? Owing to the fact that in the reality of climate change, it will help the farmers adapt to climate change as rising temperatures have caused extreme weather events, heat waves, cloud burst that can cause immediate loss of the large produce, but at the same time also affect pest and disease behavior. The function, what this clean plant program is, establishing clean plant centers dedicated to maintaining disease-free foundation materials for cultivation. These centers will feature, so this is relevant for your prelims again, okay, will feature laboratories equipped with cutting-edge diagnostic testing materials, will be staffed with experts who are trained in the diagnostic aspects. The project will roll out a clean plant certification scheme, accrediting private nurseries and testing and certifying their planting materials as well. Implemented, which is the implementing agency, the Ministry of Agriculture and Farmer Welfare. How? Through the executing arm of it, National Horticultural Board and ICAR, Indian Council for Agricultural Research. That is how it will be implemented. A small capsule of information relevant primarily for your prelims. Now understand, if you take a look at it, Clean Plant Program was launched when? 2023. But the loan has been provided now by ADB. Next year, a question can be asked on the Clean Plant Program. Now, does not mean that UPSC is asking question from the current affairs 2 years back. UPSC is asking you questions from the current affairs within 12 months. But then the implication of it, the original program is old. So that is where you have to expand the ambit of information as well. Now the protected areas in news. Ratapani Tiger Reserve, after a long delay of more than a decade, there has been an in-principle nod by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change to declare this region as the 57th Tiger Reserve of the country and the 8th Tiger Reserve of Madhya Pradesh. So here, where is Ratapani? How is it that a Tiger Reserve comes into existence? So on December 2, India got the 57th Tiger Reserve in Madhya Pradesh Ratapani Wildlife Sanctuary after receiving in-principle approval from Union Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. Now, what is it? What is a Tiger Reserve? Tiger Reserve is a protected region for conservation of tigers. You see, the population of tigers in our country had been declining quite significantly over the past century. That is when in 1973, you had the launch of Project Tiger. Under this, tiger reserves were declared, and tiger reserve typically will have a core zone and a kind of a buffer zone, which is a transition area. This is the core zone, and then you have the buffer zone. So the core zone is also a part mostly of any wildlife sanctuary or a national park, and so is the case of a buffer zone. So what is done? How is it that a region is declared as a tiger reserve? So basically, this is something where a particular region is identified by the state government. The state government takes a look at a particular region which has got tiger population, identifies the entire stretch where the associated plant species which can support herbivore, enough amount of herbivore species are there for the prey for the tigers so that the tigers can have enough food to eat. That entire region is then declared to be conserved. So the state government carries out the identification, identifies the region. Once the state government identifies the region, then after that, you will observe that it is provided or it is given to National Tiger Conservation Authority, NTCA, which is the apex body. Even if you want to alter the boundary of a tiger reserve, in principle, approval from NTCA is required. So NTCA, it goes for the approval of the NTCA. After that, you have the designation of the tiger reserve by the central government, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, right? So approval by ministry, which is a straightforward process. Under which particular act? Under Wildlife Act, Wildlife Protection Act 1972. Under the provisions of that act, a region will be declared as a kind of a tiger reserve. So that is the entire process behind it. Okay. Now, when we talk about Ratapani, where is it situated? This is where almost in the central portion of Madhya Pradesh is where you will find the presence of Ratapani Tiger Reserve. Now, Madhya Pradesh, basically, if you observe, this is the border with Maharashtra. This is the bordering zone with Rajasthan, Gujarat, and then with Uttar Pradesh here, right, to the south of the Chambal region. This is where you have Ratapani. Now, this is the 8th tiger reserve of Madhya Pradesh. So, which are the other 7 tiger reserves of Madhya Pradesh? You have Bandhavgarh, which had been in news quite recently. Why? Because of the death of elephants, of this around 13 elephants of the same herd died. Why? Because they had consumed kodo millet, which were impacted by the fungal infections. Then Satpura Tiger Reserve, Pench National Park and Tiger Reserve, Kanha Tiger Reserve, Panna Tiger Reserve, which is being impacted. Panna Tiger Reserve has also been in news. Why? Because of the impact created due to the Ken-Betwa interlink project. Virangana Durgavati Tiger Reserve, the immediately earlier tiger reserve which was declared, and Sanjay Dubri Tiger Reserve. These are the existent tiger reserves in Madhya Pradesh. Here you can also expect a kind of a match the following kind of question, asking you to match the tiger reserve with the state associated. Then, after that, another protected area which has been in news is the Raimona National Park. Raimona National Park has been in news because of the security forces being able to catch certain poachers, right? So here, where is it that it is located? First of all, this is the region of the Raimona National Park. It is in a contiguous zone with the region of Bhutan, right? It is present in Assam. So first of all, location. It is located across the Indo-Bhutan border in the Kokrajhar district of the Bodoland Territorial Region in Assam. It was declared a national park on 5th of June 2021. It shares contiguous patches, forest patches, with the Phibsu Wildlife Sanctuary and the Jigme Singye Wangchuk National Park in Bhutan. This is a region where you will find lot of rhino population also moving through from Bhutan into the marshes of Assam and vice versa, creating a transboundary conservation landscape which is significantly large. Now, the rivers draining through this, that is also relevant. Sankosh River runs beside the west of the park, and then you have the Saralbhanga River on the eastern part of that region as well. Now, the park is famous for the endemic species golden langur, right, which is the mascot of the borderland region. So that becomes relevant for your exam. Golden langur to be found in which area? And other species, elephants, wild tiger, wild bison, white spotted deer, all of them are to be found in the region. Okay. Now taking a look at the protected species in news. Which are the various different species which have been in use. So starting with the red-breasted flycatcher. Now red-breasted flycatcher has been in use owing to its migrational pattern, where during the winter months it comes over to warmer regions like India, and it has been sighted in the region of the Aminpur Lake in Hyderabad. So it was found in the Aminpur Lake in Hyderabad, and it migrates from Eastern Europe to escape the harsh winter season. Right. Now it is a small bird over 11 to 12 centimeter and can be found occasionally feeding on figs, right, in the various urban gardens. This is a kind of a bird that you will observe in many of the urban regions as well. It is not a sparrow, but does appear quite similar to that. Just that it is much brighter than the general urban sparrow that you will sight. Now here migrates from Eastern Europe to escape the harsh winter and enjoy the moderate temperature with the abundance of food. It breeds from spring to summer in the deciduous mixed forest of Eastern Europe across Central Asia. In winter months, it migrates to forest, woodlands, orchards, and roadside trees of the Indian subcontinent. So here, what is relevant for your exam? What does it feed upon? Where does it migrate from? When does it arrive in India? And which part of India? That is relevant for your exam. Okay. It can be found in peninsular India during the winter season from October to March. As per IUCN, it is a species of least concern. Now, other species which has been in news is the Indian star tortoise, owing to research regarding the genetic diversity of the Indian star tortoise. Now, this Indian star tortoise, where the ancestry of the tortoise is quite old, going back to the time of the Gondwana land. That is how old the species is and the existence of the species is. Now, this Indian star tortoise is something which is typically found in the northwestern part of the country, many parts of central India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan as well. But this is also which is smuggled. During the rainy season, when the population increases, smuggling is also quite significant. And that is where the population is impacted. Unscientific release into the nature has also impacted the population quite significantly. So here, what is that Indian star tortoise? They are hardy herbivores and have begun to be found as exotic house pets. But this is illegal. This is not allowed. Okay. Now, they are found across the Indian subcontinent overall, more specifically in the central and the southern part of India, West Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Typically found in dry open habitats such as scrub forest, grassland and rocky outwood. This is where the theory goes, that its ancestors, they moved over and they existed in the region of Gondwana land. Now, as India split up from the Gondwana land, the climatic condition started becoming drier. Due to the drier climatic condition, these species of tortoise, they got used to the drier scrubland condition. That is why to be found in northwestern India, peninsular India and central portion of India as well. Now, IUCN red list, vulnerable, As per the Wildlife Protection Act, it is in Schedule 1, and as per CITES in Appendix 1 means maximum conservation, maximum protection. Okay, so these are the various species in use, various protected areas in use, and the various topics in use. That brings us to the end of the discussion for the day. I sincerely wish that the discussion is something which was helpful and fruitful. You have added information of current affairs to your existing knowledge set, and do ensure that you are able to revise that as well, and ensure that there is a kind of cataloging that you do, a kind of a note making that you do for the protected areas, the protected species. Your task for the exams will become easier. If you have liked that, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button, and let us know your feedback in the comment section below. Join us tomorrow for the event celebrating the anniversary, and till then, do take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.